How's it going, Highlanders? Welcome to the final exam review session where we're going to cover the newest material since Exam 2. If you're looking to study that material from Exam 1 or the material that was covered on Exam 2, then I encourage you to check out those Exam 1 and Exam 2 review sessions, which have been posted up there for you. Right, so as far as this review session is concerned, we're going to be covering chapters 13 and 14 on monetary policy, or again, the newest material since Exam 2. As far as your final exam is concerned, it will cover chapters 1 through 3, 7 through 9, and 11 through 14, or all the chapters that we have covered since the beginning of class in this 10-week course. There are 41 multiple choice questions. Each question is worth 2 points. That means you can miss one and still get 80 out of 80 on the exam, or you can get 82 out of 80 if you get all 41 questions correct. You will have 120 minutes or 2 full hours to complete the exam, and you will be taking it through iLearn just like all your other online exams, only you will be taking out your regularly scheduled final exam time, which will be on Friday, June the 12th from 11:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. You'll be able to log into the exam anytime between 11:30 and 12:30. Again, we're going to use a staggered start so that not everybody tries to log in there at once and crash the system. And then you have 2 hours to complete the exam once you start it. So again, your 2-hour time limit will start running the minute you start that exam, and you do have to start it within that hour time frame. As far as studying for this exam is concerned, here's how I do it. I go through your class notes that hopefully you've been taking while watching all the lecture videos. Again, if I didn't talk about it, it won't be on there. Check out the study guide and these review session slides, as well as all of your old past review sessions to help you organize your studying. So I've got one full study guide that covers all of the material, and then again, this review session coupled with your Exam 1 and Exam 2 review sessions will review all the material for you. If you're looking for any questions to practice, you can take a look at all of your old discussion session assignments, all of your old module quizzes, all of your old unit quizzes, your extra credit practice tests, the course book questions, the practice questions. They all come out of the same test bank, or I've either used them from that test bank or created them individually. So in other words, they all come out of the same place, which means that they'll be very similar to the types of questions you will see on the final exam. Now, they might not be the exact same, so I wouldn't go through and try to memorize answers to questions as much as try to understand what the questions are asking, right? And make sure you know why the right answers are the right answers and why the wrong answers are the wrong answers. And then finally, you can consult your textbook or those book PowerPoint slides, or come see me in my Zoom office hours if there's anything you do not understand, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that in mind, let's get started here with Chapter 13. Make sure you know the 3 functions of money. Money serves as a medium of exchange, and what we mean by that is that with money, you can use it to help facilitate transactions, which is much more efficient than what we call a barter exchange, where you trade goods for other goods. Right? Remember, in a world without money, you have to find somebody who not only wants what you have, but also has what you want. You have to satisfy that double coincidence of wants, and that can be difficult to do. But everybody accepts money, so we can trade our goods for money and then use that money to buy the things that we want. So it just makes things easier. Money also serves as a store of value, in that it's a way to keep value over time and do so with a means that is still fairly liquid. Right, so remember that if you were to, say, grow oranges for a living, if you try to keep your oranges over time, they'd rot, and you wouldn't be any richer the next year. But with money, as long as we don't have hyperinflation, you can keep it over time. It keeps its value. You can use it to invest in the future and create a better future for yourself. Right, and so again, it's something that you can store value over time with. Money also serves as a unit of account. And what we mean by a unit of account is that it's a common denominator by which we can do things like post prices or keep track of profits. Right? Remember, in a world without money, it's hard to know how much an orange or apple is worth. There's 1,000 different things that could be traded for the orange or apple, and you have to post your prices in the units of all those thousands of things. Right? So with that in mind, money is just a common denominator that we can use to post prices, so everybody understands how much something is worth. Make sure you know the difference between M1 and M2. So make sure you know the difference between those definitions of the money supply. Remember that M1 is equal to your currency, right? When we talk about currency, we just mean all the cash and coins that are floating around out there in the system. plus your checking account or checkable deposits plus those traveler's checks for anybody who still uses those. Basically, it is your most liquid form of money, right? So remember, people who are focused on the M1 definition of money are focused on that medium of exchange function of money. And that all this stuff can be traded with right away, right? So you can use your currency, your cash and coins, you can use your checking account, or you can use your traveler's checks to buy things immediately. You can walk into the store with those things and spend them, right? Now, M2 is a much more broad definition of money, because it includes everything that is in M1 plus other things like what's in your savings account. So any interest-bearing savings deposits, plus what we call small denomination time deposits. So that's money that you have to leave in an account for a certain period of time, like a financial CD says that you might have to leave your money into that account for, say, 2 years, if it's a 2-year CD, and they'll give you a slightly higher interest for doing so, right? So again, it includes those time deposits, usually under $100,000. That's what I mean by small denomination time deposits, plus anything that you have in those money market mutual funds. Again, a mutual fund is when they pool your money with other people's money and they buy things in this money market account as a form of investment, right? So again, be sure to understand that everything in M1 is also included in M2. So if you take money from your checking account and put it into your savings account, right, then that will not affect M2 at all, because you're just taking it from one part of M2 and putting it into another part of M2. But if you take money from your checking account and put it into your savings account, then that would reduce M1, because you're subtracting money from the checking account, but you're adding money to a savings account that isn't included in that definition for M1. So be able to answer questions like that on the exam, should you happen to get one. All right. Understand how the fractional reserve banking works, right? This is the idea that banks have to hold on to less than 100% of their deposits, and therefore they can loan out the rest. So if you put $1,000 in Bank of America doesn't have to hold on to all $1,000. In fact, they don't. They hold on to a portion of it, and then they loan out the rest. Now, the interest they pay you on your savings account for keeping your $1,000 there is going to be a lot less than the interest they're charging for people who are borrowing that money, and that's how banks make money. So ideally, banks want to loan out as much money as they can, although they can hold on to what is called excess reserves, which are the amount of reserves that they have above the legal requirement. So know how to calculate the money multiplier and how the required reserve ratio affects money supply. All right, remember the money multiplier is just equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio. So again, if we were looking at it in terms of a formula, it's just 1 over the required reserve ratio, which is the legal amount that banks have to keep on hand to back up those deposits in case you want to get your money back. So if that required reserve ratio is, say, 0.20 or 20%, that means that if you put $1,000 in Bank of America has to hold on to 20% of that $1,000. So $200 will go in their vaults or as deposits with the Fed, right? That's what's known as bank reserves, right? Their vault cash plus those deposits with the Fed. The other 800, though, they can loan out. Now, again, they can hold on to more than 200 or more than that 20% as excess reserves if they like, but they certainly don't have to, and they most likely will want to loan out that money because that's how they can increase their profits, right? But again, they're going to put at least $200 of your $1,000 deposit into their reserves. They'll loan out the other 800. Whoever gets the other 800 is then going to spend it. Wherever they spend it, then that money might end up in a bank somewhere, and the bank's going to have to hold on to 20% of that 800, and they can loan out the rest. And that's how these banks kind of multiply money. So with that in mind, if the required reserve ratio is 20%, then our money multiplier is equal to 1 over 20%. That's going to be equal to 5. That means if there's a $1,000 increase in the money supply, that could create an additional or $1,000 injection into the economy, or that could create as much as a $5,000 increase in the money supply because that whole what we call money multiplier, or often known as the potential deposit expansion multiplier. Again, this is as big as the multiplier can possibly be. Right now, the multiplier could end up smaller than that if people don't put their money in a bank but hold on to it and say they're safe at home or in their purse or wallet, or if banks hold on to excess reserves and don't lend out all of the money that they're allowed to lend out, then it could make that multiplier smaller. But again, this money multiplier indicates as big as the multiplier effect can possibly be. Now, if the Fed wants to increase money supply, then one thing they might do is lower those reserve requirements. After all, if the required reserve ratio is just 10% or 0.10, then that money multiplier is equal to 1 over 0.10, which is going to be equal to 10, right? So again, if you put $1,000 in Bank of America, now Bank of America only has to hold on to $100. That means they can loan out the other 900. That 900 will then be spent and end up in a bank, and that bank only has to hold on to 10% of that. So they only have to hold on to $90, and they can loan out the other 810, and so forth and so on. Right, so again, it's going to have a much bigger multiplier effect. The size of the multiplier could be a lot bigger as a result of this decrease in the required reserve ratio. Now, if the Fed is worried about inflation and they want to use restrictive monetary policy, then they could increase that required reserve. I mean to make that big. They could increase those required reserves to, say, 0.50. In which case the money multiplier would be 1 over 0.5, and that is equal to 2, right? So as you can see, the size of the multiplier shrinks when that required reserve ratio goes up. Right now, banks have to hold on to 500 of your $1,000 deposit. That means they can only loan out 500. That 500 will end up in another bank where they have to hold on to 50% of that, or 250, so it's only $250 that can be loaned out. So again, if the Fed wants to increase money supply, then they'll lower that required reserve ratio, because that will increase the size of the multiplier. If they want to reduce the money supply, then they are going to raise that required reserve ratio, right? Because by raising the required reserve ratio, that will lower the size of the multiplier, right? So again, increase in money supply, you lower the required reserve ratio. Decrease in money supply, then you're going to raise that required reserve ratio. All right. So with that in mind, here are the 4 ways in which the Fed conducts monetary policy. Right, remember, one of those ways is what's called open market operations, which is the buying and selling of bonds or government securities. So if the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply, then they're going to buy bonds. Again, by buying bonds, they're going to inject money into the economy and then take away those bonds or those pieces of paper. If they want to slow down inflation, then they might use restrictive policy by selling bonds, right? That means taking money out of the economy and replacing them with those bonds or those pieces of paper. Right, as we just talked about, expansionary policy also involves lowering the reserve requirements to increase the size of the multiplier. Restrictive policy involves raising those reserve requirements to decrease the size of that multiplier. Right, now, another way that the Fed can control monetary policy is by changing the interest rate that they charge commercial banks, which is known as the discount rate. Right, so remember that the Federal Reserve kind of serves as the banks for other banks. Right, so like the Federal Reserve is the bank that Bank of America goes to, in the same way that Bank of America is the bank that you and I go to. Right, so Bank of America can borrow money from the Fed in the same way that you and I can borrow money from Bank of America. Right. And of course, the Federal Reserve charges Bank of America for borrowing money, and that interest rate they charge them is called the discount rate. So if Bank of America is borrowing money from the Fed, they have to pay back that loan plus that interest or discount rate. So if the Fed wants to use expansionary monetary policy, then they're going to lower that discount rate and make it cheaper for Bank of America to borrow money, right? So they're going to extend more loans to these private banks like Bank of America, who can then loan out that money to other individuals. Now, if they want to use restrictive monetary policy, then they can raise the discount rate and make it more expensive for Bank of America to borrow money. That means Bank of America will borrow less money, right? So the Fed will extend fewer loans to Bank of America, and they won't have as much money to loan out to other people. Now, in the same way that we can keep our money at Bank of America can also keep excess reserves at the Federal Reserve, right? So in other words, they can have their deposits at the Fed, and the Fed pays them interest on those deposits in the same way that we get paid interest on our savings accounts that we have with our private banks. All right, so if Bank of America has a deposit with the Fed, then they can pull that money out plus any interest that they've received on that deposit. Right now, if the Fed wants to use expansionary monetary policy, then they're going to reduce the interest they're paying on those excess reserves, right? Because if they get a smaller interest rate, then banks aren't going to be as eager to keep their money at the Federal Reserve. They're going to be more eager to lend that money out to private individuals instead. Right now, if the Fed wants to use restrictive policy, then they're going to increase the interest paid on these excess reserves, which will encourage banks to keep more money at the Fed and reduce the amount of money that they're loaning out. So again, these are the ways that the Fed conducts monetary policy. Please make sure that you are familiar with those for the exam. So that is Chapter 13. Let's go through a few practice questions and make sure that we can answer them in case you get questions like this on the test. So the first question says a commercial bank has $1 million of customer checking deposits and actual reserves of $300,000. So they have a total of $1 million being deposited with the bank, and of that $1 million, they are holding on to $300,000 either in their vaults or with deposits at the Fed. Now, if the reserve ratio is 20%, what is the maximum amount of new loans that this bank can extend? Well, if the reserve ratio is 20%, then that means that they have to hold on to 20% of that $1 million by law. So that means that they have to hold on to $200,000. So that's their required reserves. Now, if they have to hold on to $200,000 by law, and they're currently holding on to $300,000, then that means they have $100,000 of excess reserves that they are legally allowed to loan out. So $100,000 is the answer you're looking for on this one. That's the maximum amount of new loans they can extend and still meet that legal requirement. Right, so be able to answer a question like that on the exam. Also, be able to answer a question like this: which of the following would cause the money supply in the United States to decrease? Another way of asking this is which of the following kind of represents this idea of restrictive monetary policy? And as we talked about earlier in this review session, an increase in reserve requirements or forcing banks to hold on to more money and loan out less is going to decrease the size of that money multiplier, and that's going to cause the money supply to decrease. Right? A decrease in the discount rate will actually cause money supply to go up, as banks are more likely to borrow money from the Fed to loan out. A purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve will also increase the money supply, and an increase in the world supply of gold won't necessarily affect the money supply one way or another. So again, A is the answer that you are looking for. With that in mind, that is it for Chapter 13. So let's go into the final chapter of the class, and that is Chapter 14. So make sure you know how the money market works, right? In other words, know the price and quantity in that market. Remember, the price is the nominal interest rate, and the quantity is the quantity of money. When we talk about the quantity of money, we're talking about the quantity of money that people want to hold. Right? Know why the curves are sloped the way they are. So know why the money demand curve is downward sloping, because at higher nominal interest rates, people are going to be less eager to hold on to money because they get that higher rate of return by putting it in their savings account. Right? At these lower nominal interest rates, they're going to be more likely to want to hold that money, say, in their wallet or purse or safe at home, because they don't get as high a return on those deposits in their bank account. Right, so again, we're talking about holding money here. We're talking about holding money on your actual person, so like in your wallet or in your purse or under your mattress or anywhere except for your bank account. Right, and then know why the money supply curve is vertical, because money supply is set by the Federal Reserve and does not depend on that nominal interest rate. And of course, the equilibrium in the money market is where money demand intersects money supply. Also, make sure you know how the Fed affects the money market through monetary policy. Right, remember that expansionary monetary policy is designed to shift money supply to the right by increasing money supply through the 4 ways we just talked about in Chapter 13, and this will lead to lower interest rates. Restrictive monetary policy is designed to decrease money supply or shift that money supply curve to the left, again using those 4 ways that we talked about in Chapter 13, and that is going to end up raising interest rates. For a graphical description of how that works, let's go ahead and draw it out. So if we're going to draw our money market, remember we're going to need a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And on that vertical axis, we're going to put a lowercase I to represent our nominal interest rate. And then on the horizontal axis, right, we've got the quantity of money, so Q subscript M there. And then remember that we have a downward sloping demand for money because, again, at that higher nominal interest rate, you'll be more likely to put money in the bank. You'll be less likely to demand to hold it in your safe or in your wallet. Right, again, at the lower interest rates, you're going to be less likely to put in the bank, so you're going to want to hold on to more of that money. And then we have a vertical supply curve that represents the supply of money. Again, vertical because it's just wherever the Fed sets it, right? It doesn't depend on what the nominal interest rate is. And where those two curves intersect, that gives us an equilibrium. So this is our equilibrium quantity of money, which we'll call QM star. And again, that's going to give us the equilibrium nominal interest rate, which we'll call I star. All right. So now if the Fed wants to conduct some expansionary monetary policy, right, remember they can do that either by buying bonds or lowering that discount rate or lowering those required reserves or lowering the interest that they're paying on excess reserves deposited with them there at the Fed. Either of those, any of those four ways will increase the money supply, and by increasing the money supply, they're going to shift that supply curve to the right. Remember, all increases are shifts to the right, all those decreases are shifts to the left. That rule has never changed. So we'll call this SM2. And again, where that intersects our demand curve, that's going to give us a new equilibrium in this money market, right? So we have a new amount of money that people are going to be willing to hold on to. That's that people are going to be willing to hold on to more, and that is eager to put it in the bank. And the reason why is because you're going to have these lower interest rates. So we'll call this I2 star. So again, that's what happens when you use this expansionary monetary policy. Now, if we were to wanted to use this restrictive monetary policy, again, that could mean selling bonds, that could be raising the discount rate, raising those reserve requirements, or raising the interest that they're paying on excess reserves deposited with them there at the Fed. Any of those is going to decrease money supply, and again, a decrease is always a shift to the left. Call that S subscript M3. And again, where that intersects the demand curve, that gives us a new equilibrium with a higher interest rate. And again, people holding less money because the opportunity cost of holding money is a lot higher, given that they can make more money by putting it in their bank account. Right, so again, that's how the Fed would increase these interest rates, through using this restrictive monetary policy. So make sure you're familiar with how monetary policy affects this money market, right? And again, the effect it's going to have on interest rates. So moving forward here, know how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. Remember that expansionary monetary policy is going to increase aggregate demand by lowering those interest rates. Remember that when interest rates are lower, consumption and investment increases, right? So remember that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus inflation, right? If we have lowered that nominal interest rate, then all else constant, in other words, if the inflation doesn't change, then you have also lowered the real interest rate. And when the real interest rate is going down, remember that causes consumption to go up and investment to go up. So people are more likely to spend money and borrow money when interest rates are lower, as opposed to when interest rates are higher, right? Remember that also when we have lower interest rates, then that means that people aren't going to be as eager to put money in U.S. banks and businesses anymore. So people in foreign countries can now put money in their own countries at these relatively higher interest rates because the U.S. interest rates have gone down, right? So in other words, our capital inflows are going to go down. And when capital inflows goes down, that's going to cause the U.S. dollar to depreciate. And then when the U.S. dollar depreciates, it's going to cause net exports to go up, because now people in other countries find U.S. goods to be relatively cheaper, so they're going to buy more and our exports will go up. At the same time, Americans will find foreign goods to be more expensive after the dollar depreciates, so imports will go down, right? Also, asset prices tend to increase. Remember, that would be like the price of your stock portfolio or maybe the value of your home, right? Those might also go up as well, and that's going to make people kind of optimistic about the economy and feel comfortable spending more. So these are the ways in which expansionary monetary policy can increase aggregate demand through lowering those interest rates. Now, restrictive monetary policy can decrease aggregate demand by increasing these interest rates through all of these same channels, just moving in the opposite direction, right? So again, real interest being equal to our nominal interest rate minus inflation, right? If we've increased the interest rate by restricting money supply, right, then again, all else constant or inflation not changing, that's going to make our real interest rate go up. When real interest rate goes up, that means that we are going to be less eager to spend money because we're going to be more eager to put it into the bank and capture that higher interest rate. We're also going to be less eager to borrow money for the purposes of investing because now it's going to be more expensive to borrow money at that higher interest rate. Also, higher interest rates are going to encourage people from other countries to put their money in U.S. banks in order to get that high interest rate. And so it's going to cause our capital inflows to increase. And when capital inflows increases, that's going to cause the dollar to appreciate, which is good if you're buying goods from other countries, but not good if you're trying to sell goods to other countries. And so that's going to cause net exports to go down, as now Americans are going to find foreign goods relatively cheaper, so they're going to buy more goods from other countries, so imports are going to go up. But people in other countries are going to find American goods more expensive, so they're going to buy fewer goods from the United States, making exports go down. So net exports are going to go down. Also, you're going to see your asset prices decrease. So maybe the value of people's homes might go down, or maybe the value of their stock portfolio might go down, making people more pessimistic about the economy and less eager to spend money, right? So again, this restrictive policy will decrease aggregate demand through these channels as a result of increasing these interest rates. So make sure you're familiar with those for the exam. And then know the effects of monetary policy in both the short run and the long run. Remember that expansionary monetary policy can help restore the economy to full employment if it is employed when the economy is in a recession by increasing that aggregate demand, right? However, if the economy is in long run equilibrium, then this expansionary monetary policy can create a short run expansion, so increase real GDP and lower unemployment, but that won't last, right? Remember, that's only a short run change. In the long run, the economy will be restored, but be restored at higher prices. So in the long run, expansionary monetary policy only leads to inflation. Restrictive monetary policy, again, can help restore the economy to full employment or kind of slow down that inflationary boom as long as it is employed during an expansion. Having said that, if we are in long-run equilibrium when that restrictive monetary policy impacts the economy, then it can actually create a recession, so that's lower GDP and higher unemployment. Again, that recession might not last, but you're only going to have or end up with deflation in the long run, which sounds good if you're somebody who likes to buy stuff, but is not so good if you're somebody who likes to sell stuff, right? So remember that monetary policy needs to be timed correctly in order for it to be effective at stabilizing the economy, and it suffers from all the same timing lags as fiscal policy does, right? In other words, it takes a while for the Fed to recognize where the economy is headed. They're notoriously bad at predicting when the economy is going to go into a recession, and then they have to administrate whatever changes that they'd like to make, right? And then these changes actually have to work their way through or impact the economy. By the time we get through all these timing lags, then it could be the case that the economy is already back at its full employment level, in which case this monetary policy will actually increase the instability rather than reduce it, or make the economy more unstable rather than make the economy more stable. Right, so keep that in mind. There are some side effects to using this monetary policy, just like there were side effects to using that fiscal policy. All right, so be able to answer questions like this on the test as well. An unanticipated shift to a more expansionary monetary policy by the Fed will. Well, remember that if we're using expansionary monetary policy, then we're reducing those real interest rates. We're not increasing it by shifting that money supply curve to the right. So we already know immediately that A and C are not the right answer, right? Now remember that if we're using expansionary monetary policy, reducing real interest rates are going to help increase people's desire to spend money, increase people's desire to borrow money, and that should increase aggregate demand in at least in the short run, right? So D is the answer you're looking for on this one. Remember that reducing real interest rates will actually lead to a depreciation of the dollar, not an appreciation of the dollar, and that's what leads to an expansion in net exports. So this is the culprit here, right, that makes B wrong, right? That should be depreciation rather than appreciation. All right, so that's why D is the answer you're looking for on that one. All right, and then the next practice question here says the short-run impact of an unanticipated shift to a more restrictive monetary policy is most likely to be a reduction in. Remember, in the short run, if we use restrictive monetary policy, then it's going to create a reduction in real output or lower real GDP. Again, if the economy is already in long-run equilibrium, then it could lead to that short-run recession, right? If anything, it will cause an increase in unemployment, right? So we know that the answer is not B because it won't lead to a reduction in unemployment. And as far as output being unaffected, remember that's not the case in the short run, right? Output as well as prices are affected, at least in the short run. Only prices, however, are affected in the long run, right? The size of the budget deficit is not something that's affected by monetary policy. That is something that is affected by fiscal policy. That is why D is not the answer you're looking for on this one. Okay, and then the last part that we talked about in class was kind of how monetary policy has worked throughout time, or the historical effects of monetary policy, and just a brief history on the causes of some of the most largest economic declines in the United States' history. So know the reasons why the Great Depression was so long and severe, right? One of those reasons was the Federal Reserve started to contract the money supply immediately before, during, and after the initial economic downturn. So remember, the 1920s were a booming time period known as the Roaring Twenties. The Fed was worried about those Roaring Twenties getting a little too out of control, so they started to enact some restrictive monetary policy. Unfortunately, by the time they were enacting that restrictive monetary policy, the economy was already starting to calm itself down. So monetary policy actually impacted the economy right about the same time that you had the economic collapse. And then they kept using restrictive monetary policy even after the economy collapsed. And so, again, when you use this restrictive policy and the economy is already in a recession, you're just going to make that recession longer and deeper, right? Remember, at the same time that all this was happening, though, the government instituted the biggest trade restriction in United States history, that Smoot-Hawley tariff, which increased taxes on imports by 50% on over 3,000 imported items, and countries responded with retaliatory tariffs of their own. And that caused trade to actually decrease by more than 50% and causing unemployment to soar. We also had huge tax increases at this time. Remember, the top marginal tax rate went from 25% up to 79%, meaning that the government took 79 cents out of every extra dollar that somebody earned, right, causing people to want to earn fewer dollars, open up fewer factories, and create fewer jobs. You also have price controls, regulations, and constant policy changes. Right, those included the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which again used taxpayer dollars to pay farmers to destroy food and livestock in an effort to raise those farm prices by decreasing supply. Of course, that was pretty ineffective. It's not a good idea to pay people to destroy food at a time when people are starving to death and raise prices at a time when people don't have any money. It was declared unconstitutional a couple years after it was passed. Also, as part of these regulations under the Roosevelt administration and New Deal policies was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which again forced companies to stop competing with one another or organize together as cartels. It did things like set a certain price and quantity that firms were allowed to charge and produce, right? Certain working conditions that firms had to have, and distribution methods were also set. Right, firms weren't allowed to really compete on any of these things. And again, when you get rid of competition, you get rid of that stimulus for innovation and that motivation to make your products faster, better, and cheaper. Right, so the industrial production actually dipped after this policy was passed and never got past its pre-NIRA level until that was declared constitutional again a couple years after it was passed. Right, so these are all policies that made the Great Depression as long and severe as it was. We also talked about the economic crisis of 2008, known as the Great Recession. Right? Make sure you understand the causes of this economic crisis, one of which is that the government well-meaningly tried to get more poor people into buying homes or getting mortgage loans. So they encouraged those government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to extend more loans to people below a certain income level. Now, the only way for these lending institutions to meet those targets was by giving loans to people that they otherwise wouldn't give loans to, so people with little to no down payment and people with bad or incomplete credit history. So this resulted in a huge increase of what are known as subprime loans, which are loans that go to people with a bad credit history, and Alt-A loans, which are loans that go to people with an incomplete credit history, or maybe no credit history at all. Right. So with that in mind, these regulations, again, kind of eroded the integrity of these mortgage loans. Now, while that was going on, the Federal Reserve, in an effort to combat a recession in 2001 caused by those September 11th terrorist attacks, kept interest rates really low. and they even kept interest rates low after the economy started to recover. And these low interest rates increased the attractiveness of adjustable rate mortgages. Those are mortgages where the payments are low when interest rates are low, and then your payments go up when interest rates are higher, right? So again, these poor people who didn't have any down payment and bad credit history were now buying these huge houses that they probably couldn't afford because they could afford these payments as long as these interest rates stayed down and the Fed was keeping them low. But then the Fed started worrying about inflation, so they started using restrictive monetary policy by increasing those interest rates, and then increasing those interest rates caused those housing payments to go way up. And now these people, these poor people, again with no down payment and bad credit histories, can no longer afford these loans and couldn't make these payments. So they started to default, which means that they're late with their payments, and then they you saw a huge increase in foreclosure rates, which is when the bank starts taking houses away from people due to non-payment. Right. Now, while this was going on, you also had increased debt to capital ratio of lending institutions, again, kind of complying with the government's desire to help people get these mortgage loans, right? The Security Exchange Commission said you only have to hold on to 8% of your deposits if you're giving commercial loans, but you only have to hold on to 4% of your deposits if you're giving residential loans. And if you can bundle those loans together in AAA securities, then you only have to hold on to 1.6% of your deposits, meaning that you can loan out all the rest, the 98.4%. And so that caused these lending institutions to become highly leveraged, with most of their money being targeted into these AAA securities that were no longer safe because those mortgage lending standards have been eroded from the points we had talked about earlier. And at the same time that was going on, we have this culture of higher and growing debt to income ratio for American households. People were carrying around more debt than ever before, and because the debt that you carry in your house is tax deductible and that you can write off the interest on your mortgage payments, then most people were carrying their debts and their homes. So again, they have a debt that's probably way too high for the amount of money that they're making. And again, that debt is concentrated in their housing assets. So when the housing market declines, right, then these people are the ones who are going to be unfortunately hurt here in terms of owing more money on their home than they have to pay, and that and more money than their home is worth. Right. So with that in mind, here are the 4 causes of the economic crisis of 2008, or 4 causes of that Great Recession. Kind of make sure you are familiar with those. All right. So let's go through a couple practice questions and make sure we understand how this works. So most economists believe that the severity and duration of the Great Depression was at least partially the result of, and the correct answer here is D, a sharp contraction in the money supply. Remember, the Fed started to decrease that money supply immediately before that stock market collapse, and then continued to decrease that money supply even after that stock market collapse. It wasn't the excessive use of credit cards that wasn't really around during this Great Depression. And it certainly wasn't a reduction in tariffs, as again we increased tariffs with that Smoot-Hawley tariff higher than ever before. And it wasn't the large budget deficits of the federal government up until this Great Depression. Right, these budget deficits were fairly rare. Right, the government didn't really run them as often as they're running them now. So D is the answer you're looking for. And then finally, adjustable rate mortgages became increasingly attractive and grew as a percentage of total outstanding mortgages during 2002 to 2004 because, and the answer for this is A, remember the Fed kept those interest rates artificially low during this period in an effort to try to stimulate the economy, and in doing so made those adjustable rate mortgages, which again means your housing payments are lower when interest rates are low, makes those types of loans more attractive. Right? It wasn't that interest rates rose sharply during this period. Remember, they didn't start raising those interest rates until later, and when they did raise those interest rates, then the adjustable rate mortgages now became unsustainable for the people who had them. Right? And it certainly wasn't that lending standards were tightened during this period. Remember, they were loosened to the point where people who didn't have any down payment at all and bad credit histories could still get pretty big housing loans. Right? And it wasn't that housing prices were declining during this period. In fact, housing prices were actually soaring during this period because it was so easy to get loans. It wasn't until the collapse in 2008 that these housing prices started to decline. So A is the answer you're looking for on this one. All right. That is all that I prepared for you for this review session. So again, this final exam will cover all of the material, including the material covered on Exam 1 and Exam 2. So if you are interested in going back through and reviewing that material, make sure you check out that Exam 1 and Exam 2 review session. And as always, just let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. You can just shoot me an email or come visit me in those Zoom office hours. Again, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But until then, good luck, happy studying, take care.